Hi, I'm Greg Lindsay, Director of Research for New Cities. And the reason I'm here today is talking about sustainability is because, well, this is why we need it. This is, of course, North America in the last month or so. Multiple hurricane storms over the Atlantic, smoke from wildfires across the West, sweeping here across. You can see climate change happening in real time, the result of all of our land use policies, lifestyles, everything else. Here you can see the West on fire, smoke pouring across. Some of the most livable areas in the United States becoming temporarily at least some of the most polluted cities on the planet. And this, of course, the eerie orange glow over Northern California. What good is technology if this is the kind of world we're inhabiting? And this is what I want to talk a bit about today, about new models of urban sustainability here and thinking about what the next decade of our lives will be like. And I've been thinking a lot these days about Robert Frost and his poem, Fire and Ice. Some say the world will end in fire, he wrote. And of course, it doesn't take much to think about climate change and the fires. And then the other correlation to this is some say in ice. And this is, of course, during the pandemic that's still raging here, the people complaining about economic lockdowns and the damage we've done to our economy. Now, there's some truth to that because we did see in this massive natural experiment over this spring, what would happen if we in fact shut down the world. And you can see here that scientists predicted that in April, we saw global carbon emissions fall 17%. That's the good news. The bad news is that we had to basically destroy a third of the United States economy temporarily to do that, which I think is interesting in several respects, one of which being it shows the limits of sort of personal choice in combating climate change and sustainability. Even when we decided that we were not going to move as little as possible, we still saw that systematically the effects of that were double. So we basically need to rethink at more fundamental levels our various systems of urban design. So I think about this, this is from the same paper here showing, and I would point you to that top left graph here on surface transport, that basically the area that we can have the most immediate impact when it comes to decarbonizing the world and building more sustainable real estate and urbanism is to think about how we move and how often we move. And this, of course, is one of the areas that's most under discussion here about the end of commutes. The downside is that over the last 10 years, we've moved even further away from sustainability until now. This is from the International Energy Agency, which pointed out recently that SUV sales alone were the second largest driver of greenhouse gas emissions over the last decade. Not just buying cars, just shifting from cars to SUVs and light trucks. Now, again, we have a whole opportunity here to rethink how we move through cities because the 5-day commute is in such flux because of work from home. But it seems like the world might end in fire because we're seeing already the mobility trends pointing out that commuters in places like the United States, transit is down by half, but we've seen driving and also walking rebound to pre-pandemic levels. But even in other developed nations, we're seeing there, Germany, for instance, walking and transit are back to even higher than they were before, but driving even more than that. And the same is in Japan. I don't quite know what to make sure of this graph, but the Japanese are really excited about their cars. So, from what I've tasted of desire, I hold with those who favor fire, to quote Robert Frost. We are going to resume our movements in different ways and patterns. We need to think, though, about how we can live. So I'm not here to prescribe a world of permanent lockdown or degrowth. I am here to think about how we are going to react and adapt our environments to a world of both post-COVID and also of climate change. So I want to talk about two ideas today, mostly. The first is proximity city. This is the idea of rethinking how we move, live, work, and play in cities on the other side of work from home. If there's one change that I think will outlast the pandemic, and I do believe we'll have a vaccine, it's this idea that, the notion that we have to go to the same place 5 days a week to work for 8 hours a day or more, of course, has been completely thrown out the window. I don't think we'll all permanently work from home, but we are going to permanently work from locations other than our home and other than the office. And this gives us an opportunity to rethink the patterns of daily life in a much more local, sustainable manner. Now, this idea comes from Paris. This is where Carlos Moreno, who's a professor at the Sorbonne, has been advising Mayor Anne Hidalgo, who recently won re-election, to rebuild Paris as a true city of neighborhoods. And this is their idea of the 15-minute city. The idea that you should be able to live, work, and play and achieve all of your daily needs within a 15-minute bicycle ride or walk from your home. Now, this is very interesting in several respects. I mean, it's this idea, as Moreno puts it out here, that if we can basically sort of shrink our daily existence, shrink our carbon emissions from mobility, bring services closer to us, we can achieve greater well-being, we can basically know our neighbors and build a more sustainable planet. And this is the idea, right? I mean, we think of mobility and we think of commuting as us and access, as us going to places and things. And the big transformation in e-commerce and delivery and mobility has been things coming to us. And this is what I'm going to talk a bit about some of the ramifications here in a moment. But, these are some of the beautiful images that Mayor Hidalgo in Paris has shown, thinking about, basically taking cars out of our streets, turning it back over to pedestrians, adding new uses to this, creating this much more walkable, livable vision of what Europe can be. Now, this is interesting to me because this whole, until recently, as I pointed out again with work from home, it was completely unworkable, right? What are cities? Why do cities exist is a question that we should start with. And there's some great work done by Solly Angel and Elaine Bertoa, both professors at New York University, arguing that what cities really are labor sheds. The ability to work and live at any 2 points inside of a metropolis and travel between them. And if it's basically too far to drive to where you're working, then it's basically a different city. And so here they point out, in Los Angeles, this is mapping some of the commutes there that existed before the pandemic, people living on one side of the greater region of LA and commuting to the other side. All of this is potentially, for white collar workers especially, out the window. We have much more possibilities now for those of us who tote laptops around to rethink about how we work, the ability to access these labor sheds locally, regionally, even nationally or internationally, while living very close to home. And this blurring of the city and the office, which has been predicted for at least 10 years, this is from a project that friends of mine worked on, thinking about what mobile working would look like, is now finally upon us and gives us an opportunity to think about what these workspaces should look like, what these services should be, and so forth. And, as a starting point, you've seen the images, I'm sure. This is from Vanderbilt Avenue in Brooklyn, New York here, of what street closures have done, of how we've used the pandemic as an opportunity to reclaim space on the street from cars, not in the name of climate change per se, but in the name of social distancing. And we've seen the incredible sociability, the incredible uses that people have created out of this that are becoming, as the pandemic expands, more and more ornate. This is a favorite image of mine coming from Flushing, Queens, a Korean ramen restaurant there, basically building these elaborate structures here to extend and intensify the uses of the street. And I think this is not going to be cannibalizing real estate when the pandemic is over. I don't think it's an either or. I think we're going to see that people drawn to these structures and drawn to these uses will intensify their uses of our cities. And, I think it's telling, for example, the scooter in this image, because mobility is a real key part of this. In the United States, we've seen during the pandemic that e-bike sales and bicycle sales are through the roof, more than doubling over time. We've seen various cities around the world, including Paris, Milan, and also Bogota, commit to how they're going to rely on the bicycle going forward. This is the mayor of Bogota here on one of the ciclovias that the city pioneered. She recently declared their goal of achieving 50% of all trips in the city by bicycle by the year, I believe, 2040. Now that's interesting in a couple of respects. One of which is, they basically failed to build a metro or expand their bus service, but it's also a commitment to basically like, how do we create new forms of infrastructure to allow people to cycle and invest in these kinds of modes? Here in the United States, we've seen innovative startups like Reef Technology, which, as you may know, is a billion-dollar backed SoftBank startup that's been acquiring parking lots around the country and turning them into ghost kitchens and other sort of uses. They've partnered with DHL, for example, to use electric cargo bikes as a way of doing their deliveries, as a way of, again, creating this proximity, bringing services closer to you in your neighborhoods by converting parking into more usable assets, and then using, sustainable modes of transportation as a way of decreasing carbon emissions, air pollution, and so forth. Now, this is getting even more interesting because now as Amazon and the bigger players enter this, the notion of a 15-minute city, originally the notion that you would walk out of your house and go to things around you, is actually becoming e-commerce giants bringing things within 15 minutes of you. So Matt Newberg, who runs a great website called Hungry, recently went undercover as a delivery driver for the new Amazon Fresh stores that are popping up in Los Angeles. And in his report on it, here he's pointing out basically the concentric circles of the two. He realized that in days worth of making deliveries, he never traveled further than a mile or a mile and a half from the centralized Amazon location. And in his report, he wrote that Amazon is bringing the 15-minute proximity city to you. And I think this is, of course, the next generation of e-commerce, just as they started with overnight deliveries at big centralized warehouses, then pushed to huge warehouses on the periphery of cities. Now we're seeing Amazon, for example, has launched an initiative to create 1,000 new suburban warehouses across the country. We're seeing as these commerce companies are pushing closer and closer to those of us in urban neighborhoods. And this, of course, has led to the rise of ghost kitchens, of dark stores, of cloud kitchens, and so forth. Here's Matt Newberg making his deliveries right here, carrying these Amazon Prime packages. And, and we're seeing, autonomy and other technologies promise to bring this even further. So Neuro is, one of the handful of autonomous startups they recently commissioned a report from Steer Group, basically arguing that by 2030, autonomous deliveries will deliver, even in the most conservative scenario, something like $630 billion of various measures, including time saved. This idea, of course, that, that we'll live lives closer to home, and all of those urban services that we once needed to travel for will now be within literally an arm's reach of an AV. So what does the mature version of this look like? Well, going back to Paris, this is a vision of the Champs-Élysées by my friend Philippe Chiambretta, who's an architect. He was commissioned to create this, and I worked on it with him before the pandemic started. But you can see, the iconic boulevard there of taking away the 8 lanes of cars and handing it over to micromobility and some autonomous vehicles, but also, of course, parks, seating, design, pedestrians, more trees as a way, of course, providing urban ground cover and soaking up carbon dioxide, rethinking what these cities can be. I just want to add one note to this, that of course the fatal flaw, or perhaps one of several fatal flaws in the proximity city vision, is of course social equity. It's one thing to imagine this for the core of Paris. The real challenge we have, of course, is thinking about how this works in America's suburbs, but also particularly in communities of color, marginalized communities that have been starved of resources. How do we build this equitably for them when they have been pushed to the edges of our cities over the last few decades? So this is something that I'm working on at New Cities, where I'm the director of research, and it's something that I think we'll be paying close attention to for the foreseeable future. How do we build a sustainable city that's also a just one? Now, the second trend I want to get to, getting a little bit more perhaps dystopian here, is what I'm calling higher ground. And this is the notion that, as we're seeing happening in the United States in real time, the realization that we will not be able to save everything. The climate change is here, that it is happening, and then we need to think about what triage of our urban areas will look like, and what role prop tech can play in that as well. So this, for example, is a map. This is even before the current California wildfires, of what they call in the trade the wildland urban interface, the WUI. This, of course, is the result of the policies that have prevented us from building in the dense cities of California that's pushed people further and further into the outlying areas, where they then become prone to wildfires. And you can sort of see here, and this is also true for flooding. This is a map by Robert Muir Woods, showing that, over the last decade, that basically some of the coastal counties that are most prone to flooding and sea level rise in the United States have experienced some of the biggest population booms. We've spent the last decade pushing more and more people into the areas that are going to be most affected by the worst effects of climate change. And as this research also shows, that not only have we been building homes and other infrastructure there, we've built back bigger homes in the events of hurricanes Katrina in 2005 and Sandy in 2012, and Irma and Maria in Florida in 2017, and so on and so on. So we need to urgently reconsider what we're building and where. And this discourse, which was previously, very, very quiet, has pushed itself into the mainstream in just literally the last few months. Managed retreat is a phrase that no elected official ever wants to utter. It was actually mentioned by Tom Steyer, of course, unelected billionaire, during the Democratic debates last year. But this phrase, managed retreat, is becoming central to the discourse, thinking again about how do we use carrots and sticks to basically compel people to move out of the most at-risk areas? How do we think about, how are we going to continue to build housing for people when we're losing more affordable housing to wildfires? How do we think about what happens if and when the insurance companies, which are non-ideological to say the least, decide that they're going to render the center of California uninsurable, which is where this is headed? And we're seeing this mounting risk to the entire financial sector in real estate. My friend Jesse Keenan was the editor of a new report from the Commodity Futures Trading Commission that basically argued of systemic risk to the United States financial system and subsystemic risk, particularly to real estate, permanent write-downs in the value of coastal real estate, and so forth. So it's not just about, how do we get people out of high-risk areas? It's also the challenge that we face over the coming decades is, how do we build more sustainably in more sustainable locales? How do we design new communities that are prepared to receive these climate migrants, whether that's locally, regionally, or across the United States? And this is a great map from Quartz, for example, crunching some data here, showing some of the areas where we might expect people to move. Interestingly enough, I think a lot of people would move out of the highest risk areas into also high risk areas. Water shortages in the Southeast, draining the aquifers of the high plains. There's incredible opportunities in the Pacific Northwest and also around the Great Lakes, of course, to rethink where we might build these new communities and how we might build them. And so Quartz imagined, as part of their exercise, a new community in the 2050s here called Leaside, a Rust Belt town that's been transformed by new climate migrants. I worked on a similar vision with a team of architects, Rafi Siegel and Susanna Drake, to imagine the coasts of New York and New Jersey in 2067. We designed, amphibious architecture that's designed to flood. We thought about how Jamaica Bay outside JFK Airport would be transformed into this great new green park, and imagined how we would design new structures. Some areas would be designed to flood, others would be hardened and more water resistant, to allow people to sort of coexist with this new, instead of a coastline, a coast zone, so to speak. And we even thought about the people who would live there. In one of my more strokes of genius, I imagine, for example, that the governors of New York and New Jersey, Governors Andrew Cuomo and John Bon Jovi, would sell off the Port Authority to basically finance new construction by the Singaporeans, and thinking about the people who might live there one day. But this is all sort of fanciful, but the more obvious opportunities, particularly for those of us who are involved in real estate and prop tech, are thinking about how do we build more sustainably and densely in the cities we have, the cities where people want to go. There's a lot of narratives right now, of course, that we're going to see post-COVID flight from America's cities. And that's true for the core of San Francisco and Manhattan right now, but we're seeing huge influxes of people into places like Denver and Portland and these secondary cities, Dallas, the Sun Belt locales where people have been coming all along. How do we build 15-minute cities for them? Well, one opportunity we can do is, of course, is to start rethinking zoning and other regulations that would allow us to build more densely here. And Portland, amidst, of course, all of the COVID, all of the forest fires, and of course the police protests, has also, their city council, as part of their progressiveness, has passed, arguably the most progressive infill zoning code in the United States, allowing people to build multiple units by right on single family homes. So if we can see more cities like Portland, like Minneapolis, like the state of Oregon at large, start to adopt these codes that will allow us to build densely in the places where people want to live, away from those urban wildlife, interface areas, we could see considerable change. And that's, of course, where the prop tech crowd comes in, because bringing those, construction technologies, financing tools, all the things that we have to basically accelerate the speed and densify those areas is arguably one of the things that we can do to make the most sustainable communities. So I want to end here with a great vision of this. One of the communities that I'm following in the United States that makes me hopeful is Cul-de-sac. This is a new 1,000-unit community being built from scratch, sort of in Tempe, Arizona, where we might think of as on the front lines of climate change with 100-degree days. But imagining a walkable community that basically turns what would have been its parking spaces into more communal assets, thinking about how to live both densely but also desirably. These are the kinds of communities that we need to see, I think, going forward in the United States. So on that note, I want to end here and end with this sort of call to arms here, that it's up to all of us to think about how do we basically take people out of harm? How do we build more sustainable lifestyles and sort of converge these two trends of the proximity city while getting to higher ground in the proverbial sense? So thank you so much for having me. And I look forward to talking to all of you about how we can build this future together.